we're going to move on to Samo, and after that, we're going to have a Q&A with Samo and Peter, and so we'll make sure we grab some stools. We can grab them from the bar for that part afterwards. Thank you. Welcome.
First off, thank you, Sander. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to think about the long-term future of the world. I've been doing research in the area of institutional analysis for about 10 years. First 7 years quite academically, last 2 years a little bit more practical application with my company Bismarck Analysis. But my true heart always lies in where might the future of our civilization lie and how we can enhance its prospects. Today's talk is going to be on the overlap of institutions and knowledge. Knowledge lives ultimately in human heads, but how it gets into those human heads is the question that education grapples with, the question that research grapples with, the question that social epistemic commons have to grapple with. Most of our universe is invisible, not literally. We can infer that there exists mass that is not detectable by our telescopes. And it's actually the vast majority of mass. Physicists have a term for this. It's called dark matter. We know it exists because this is the Andromeda galaxy. Galaxies are spinning too fast to be held together only with the visible matter that we can account for. So there's additional gravitational force. Something is pulling them all in. Now, maybe we have a flawed theory of gravity, but the current favored explanation is that there's a certain kind of mass that we can't detect. And a lot of conventional sources of where dark matter might be has been ruled out. You might naively think that black holes are an obvious candidate. They don't actually amount to enough mass to explain this phenomena. I think there is an equivalent in intellectual dark matter. There are all kinds of knowledge that are vital to the operation of our society, that are vital to the creation of new knowledge, that we can prove exist, but we cannot truly easily access. Now, there's a question, right? Well, obviously the person that has the relevant knowledge must know it exists. That's an interesting question. There's like a problem of self-awareness that philosophers have grappled with for a long time. Is it possible to know that you have, is it possible to have knowledge you don't know about? I think in a way there is, right? Like you can play basketball and not be able to derive the physics of how exactly you're playing basketball and why the ball goes into the hoop, but you have this like very embodied sense of how to handle that ball. A nice example of intellectual dark matter is, I think, the knowledge that existed in the past that we perhaps still rely on that is no longer here. This is Greek text, ancient Greek. For the vast majority of Greek authors that we know by name, so we know they existed because they're referenced in other works that are preserved, they are lost to us as actual thinkers. They only exist as references. 13% of authors from the ancient Greek world that we know about have some fragment of text preserved, and only a little under 7% of them have a complete work preserved. So you might ask yourself, well, if this stuff is lost, how are we relying on it? And I'm going to draw a straightforward path here where institutions such as governments, companies, religions, education systems, clearly influenced by Greek philosophy, quite intentionally so, both in the Renaissance and with America's founding, they were very big fanboys of the Romans and the Greeks because they were setting up a republican system from going out of a more monarchical implementation. Those thinkers crafted their thoughts in dialogue with these lost thinkers. The 5% of visible intellectual matter, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Pythagoras, all of that stuff crafted in the gravity well of the 92, 93% that we don't know about. So how many positions have we rediscovered in the last few hundred years in the domain of philosophy? How much mathematics might still be there? You might disagree about the relevance of, say, ancient Greek mathematics and so on, but consider that recently, maybe I should go into this, it's an interesting technique, right? There was, in medieval Europe, parchment was scarce. Often monks would scrape off text and rewrite new text on top of it. Basically, with modern technology, we can X-ray those parchments, my Slovenian gets in the way sometimes, originally from Slovenia, and detect that layer of scraped off text because the ink contained iron. So because of that, turns out the ancient Greeks had something quite close to calculus. Calculus was only reinvented in the 18th century. It's a fun and interesting fact. It was reinvented in the 18th century, both by like Newton, maybe Gauss, sort of, maybe something there in Europe, and in Japan. Japan also had its own completely independent variant. So we have three independent origins in very different societies, where one exists in the sort of like city-state context of the ancient Mediterranean, one exists on the cusp of an industrial revolution, one exists in an isolationist, relatively stable feudal structure that's basically not trading with anyone, the last one being Japan. So I think it's not beyond the scope of possibility that there arose mathematics that we haven't yet discovered that's in those 90%, let alone philosophy. To move to a different example of contemporary tacit knowledge, steel rests at the base of our industrial supply chain. So many of the machines that we use in everyday life perhaps are not made out of steel, but are manufactured in factories that themselves use machines that have steel as the key component. Making steel radically cheaper was a big boost to both prosperity and engineering, because when you produce a material artifact, if there's no socioeconomic niche for it to live in, if it's too expensive, it becomes a mere toy. The best example of this would be Heron's steam engine from ancient Alexandria. It was, a simple steam engine. It transformed heat into motion. There was no application for it. There was no economic niche for it. It was something that existed within the confines of a curiosity, funded for the sake of being a curiosity, rather than something like Watt's steam engine, which became useful and people wanted to copy because they wanted to, pump water out of their coal mines and all sorts of other applications over time. So the Bessemer steel process in the 19th century made steel radically cheaper. He developed a process and patented it, and then got sued by nearly everyone that tried to use the patent because they couldn't make it work, and they called him a fraud. Well, he tried to explain it over and over and over again, how to do this, how to, revolutionize steel production, making all of us vastly wealthier and indirectly not also vastly smarter. And he couldn't explain it. So what he did was raised capital, built kind of his own steel mill with partnership with some people, proved the process worked, and put a lot of those suing steel mills out of business, right? So here we had an example of knowledge that was living in one person that was only successfully transferred when that one person built out the thing, and then you could have employees come to the steel mill, you could have engineers go look at the steel mill and reproduce it. It wasn't possible to just have a description, a formal description of the process. So this is then the second kind of intellectual dark matter. The first one is knowledge that was lost, that we indirectly rely on, that was used to produce some of the knowledge we currently still use. And this other type is this tacit knowledge that exists everywhere. Again, like the basketball example, right? Our modern industrial supply chain is very complicated. Even something as simple as the processing of oil goes through many steps, from something like what we draw out of the ground to what we perhaps use and distribute. We rely on this vast global network to transport goods all over the planet. Some technologies and some kinds of knowledge live at scale. I already talked about the need to copy things, right? So there's the kind of knowledge that can live in a single lineage of student to teacher: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. There's the kind of knowledge that lives in a steel mill, how to build a steel mill that uses the Bessemer process. It might be only in 17, 20, 25 places around the world, maybe 100, maybe 200, depending on which stage of the takeoff you look at. Some technologies require a global consumer market to be viable. Some steam engines require hundreds of millions of consumers. If that network of transport, supply, breaks down, the economic incentive and niche for the technology to remain breaks down. And there's a nice historical example. About 1,100 BC, you had, actually 1,200 BC, you had a string of highly advanced civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean that were using sea trade, which, as everyone knows, it's much cheaper to transport materials, goods, and people over the sea than it is to do so over land, especially, in the age before rail. You had the Mycenaean Greeks, you had the civilization at Knossos, you had the Hittites, you had the Assyrians, you had the Egyptians. In about 50 to 60 years, almost all of those face severe collapse, with Egypt being essentially the only exception, and even the Egyptians ceased monumental construction for about 100 years. Literacy was completely lost in the Greek mainland. For about 300 years, they were illiterate after this, and writing as we know it of classical Greece, the Greece of Socrates and so on, that had to be reinvented. It was a true Greek Dark Age. Some other parts of the Middle East were a little bit luckier, but in some places, we do not find pottery. So there are some regions where pottery is not found. The importance of this is that pottery is a Neolithic technology. And when I talk to archaeologists, they say, oh, if we don't find pottery in a region in the Neolithic, we just assume it's uninhabited because it's such a ubiquitous technology. It's something that like every small tribe could make for itself. So the population collapse apparently was so bad that in some regions, they were just completely depopulated. This is a beautiful, beautiful temple from Abu Simbel. You might know of this. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has an interesting storied history when it was moved. That is a beautiful object that was crafted just before. This is monumental architecture. It has a lot of precise features so that the light from the sun hits the statue of the relevant god at exactly the right time. It took years and years to construct. It happens in a really remote location, all down in the south of Egypt, almost in the border area. It was constructed by Ramses II, right? So this is on the eve of that situation. Here is like what's been termed Agamemnon's mask, another example of wealth. It's a golden mask found from the Mycenaeans. Another example of a big trade network breaking down, and with it, a loss of knowledge. Actually, let me go a step back. The most important thing about this breakdown is this is a civilization powered by bronze. Bronze requires tin and copper. Tin and copper tend to not be found in the same regions. The crucial thing that's lost is the ability to produce bronze cheaply at scale. Again, consider steel, right? We have steel, they had bronze. Everything from weapons to the tools used to carve this out of stone, to the tools used to shape this golden mask and basically dig for the golden ore and so on. All of that is made out of bronze. So when that breaks down, states no longer can field militaries, economic productivity drops, and all of the civilizations dissipate. The red X's there, by the way, are destroyed city sites. These are just places that burn down in a period a little over 40 to 50 years. Yeah, so, ability to provide security breaks down, economic productivity breaks down. The society started basically pillaging each other as much as they could for the remaining resources. The next example of a societal breakdown that leads to a loss of technology is the Roman Empire. I hesitate to use the Roman Empire because it's an example that's been overused through the course of our history. Everyone wants to make it a morality play of some kind. Everyone has their own interpretation. I'm going to make the argument that the most significant feature of it is this large trade network with wonderful economies of scale where it's possible to safely travel from one part of the Mediterranean to another. You now have an integrated society over the whole Mediterranean basin, both the East and Western Mediterranean. You have a lot of indicators that this is a very wealthy society. We'll look at those in just a little bit. But this artifact is one that caught my attention when I first learned about it. It's the Lycurgus Cup. Has anyone here heard of this? Okay, so we have one person. The Lycurgus Cup was donated by Lord Rothschild to the British Museum in the 19th century. It was discovered a few decades earlier. It has the nice property of being a dichromic cup, which means that shine light from it from one end looks red, from the other end looks green. They didn't know how that worked. 19th century engineers didn't know how this worked, and scholars had, for about a century or two before the cup was discovered, heard references, and read references actually, where Romans are writing letters to each other and they're saying, oh, you know, Titus, I received the most marvelous gift. I received this cup that changes color depending on this, you know, where I shine light on it. The conclusion of 18th century scholars was that, you know, Titus, after talking about boring things like how many horses to buy and like, you know, how some slaves were misbehaving, became fanciful in that part of the letter and was just making up an object that obviously couldn't exist. This, when it was found in the 19th century, shown to exist, we only figured out how it worked in the 1970s, where a British laboratory analyzed the glass, and it turned out that there's a precise mixture of gold and silver particles ground to the nanometer scale, mixed into the glass during the production process. After taking references seriously, there are hundreds of references to this product, which means that, and actually all over the Mediterranean world, there might have been only a single factory of such objects, but they shipped these objects to Gaul, to Hispania, even to Britain. And demand for such objects is pretty niche. It's like, in a way, a luxury product. So as soon as the economy collapses, as soon as the ability to sell this thing to people that might be far apart and people that are relatively wealthy, as soon as the pie of wealth contracted, this is no longer economical. And then a generation or two later, no one knows how to make such a thing. We have some measures and proxies for Roman economic productivity that I think are fairly reliable. My favorite one is air pollution. You know, today we might object to the idea that we can use atmospheric pollution as an indicator of civilizational progress or prosperity, but Romans actually emitted a fair amount of lead into the atmosphere. Atmospheric lead from the Roman Empire was captured in air bubbles in ice forming in Greenland. So as the ice was forming in Greenland, in the ice there were air bubbles. The air bubbles captured a sample of the atmosphere at the time. Today, when we dig down into the various ice cores in Greenland, we can have a fairly accurate picture of the lead content of the atmosphere throughout history. And we see something interesting. The Roman Republic has a productivity peak, which is then disrupted by the warfare of the late Republic with civil wars. Once a system of peace is reestablished by Augustus, economic growth goes back up, lead production goes back up. There are various reasons to believe lead production correlates extremely well with economic growth, partially because it correlates extremely well with how many metals are they taking out of the ground. And that correlates with tools, weapons, and all the other things we are used to. China has an interesting example as well. People don't realize how severe some of their societal collapses have been. They always recovered, but when we say recovered, what do we mean? The most severe one, I think, was the end of the Han Dynasty, where population crashes over the course of 70 years by 2/3, right? So that period is romanticized in the novel The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but it is romanticization. You wouldn't actually want to live through that period, the Three Kingdoms being the big fragments that separated from the Han state. 12th century China is producing basically what we would recognize as, public square city center clocks, something very similar to what the iconic image of London is today, accurately measuring time. These clocks were then not built 400 years later. So in the Mongol dynasty and even the Manchu dynasties later on, they no longer know how to build those. There are also some Chinese books that were looted by the French and British in their interventions in the 19th century, where the only preserved copy is the looted copy, right? So in fact, it was possible that there were books being lost even as recently as the 19th century. Part of the reason was a relatively closed political system, had tight control of book printing, but part of it was there was no good socioeconomic niche for the mass printing of books in Chinese society in the 19th, 18th century, and it was hardly unique in this regard. There was no such niche in the 13th or 14th century in Europe. Let's now talk about some modern examples, 2 modern examples, and then I'll wrap up. Hopefully I'm not too far over time. Jade. Jade is a material that's quite important today. We use it in the next generation of sensors. They're trying to, the next generation of sensors that will also be used to figure out things about gravitational waves, perhaps knowledge that can resolve the puzzle of dark matter, physical dark matter. Moscow laboratories, so laboratories in Russia from Moscow State University, had for about 10 years been finding radically different measurements than their Western counterparts. Measurements of the quality of sapphire. The quality factor called Q, unoriginally, is very important for whether they're fit for these kinds of applications or not. What happened there was a breakdown not of economics of scale, but of trust. Western laboratories stuck to their guns, basically accused the Russians of faking their results. The Russians reciprocally said, you guys don't know what you're doing. It took a physical visit from Western researchers to Moscow State University for them to be like, oh, actually, we don't know what we're talking about. The Russians had it figured out. We now know how to actually get these measurements right. The fun part is the department that was doing this research in Moscow State University came dangerously close to being defunded. 1990s Russia, very chaotic, not a lot of funding for sciences, massive crash of how many, essentially weapons researchers the new Soviet state was willing to subsidize, right? A lot of the civilian programs were ultimately subsidized by military applications. Had that been defunded before the visit of Western scientists, we might be decades behind in the construction of those sensitive sensors that I mentioned earlier. There is a danger in an opportunity cost rather than a full-on loss of knowledge of you lose the concrete localized knowledge in a particular academic institution or a particular company, and there's a large opportunity cost down the line that you don't even realize that you're paying, right? This was a story with a happy ending, which is why we know about it, but that's a notable selection effect. CPU production. Okay, we talked about the need for economies of scale. We talked about trust. We talked about political things maybe getting in the way, maybe working. Currently, China is doing extremely well in replicating most relevant technologies currently manufactured in the Western world. One area where they lag are chip fabs. Chip fabs produce a large amount of the basic information infrastructure of our society today. We all rely extremely heavily on computerized technology. The best way to be robust here would be to have not a few chip fabs, but chip fabs distributed all over the world. And unfortunately, there's an economic disincentive to share knowledge here. I'm quite sure that if all the Chinese experts en masse were invited to a particular chip fab controlled by either a Western company or perhaps a Taiwanese company or an Israeli company, could figure it out, much as Western experts invited to Moscow could figure out how to make that happen. But that's where the coordination issues come in. So, okay, for a final thought, I'm going to compare the differences between a civilizational collapse, like 2 or 3 of the ones I described, and an intellectual dark age. One has a failure of critical systems. The other one also can have a failure of critical systems over time. One has loss of relevant traditions of knowledge. The other one might also have a loss of relevant traditions of knowledge. But the big differences here are in comparing the destruction of capital today, which is very visible, to the opportunity cost of capital in the future. You might not know that you are missing extremely good opportunities. And that, I think, makes the intellectual dark age problem much, much more serious. Okay, thank you.
And can I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay. So, I found that really interesting. And at a couple points, and at the end, you sort of got to my question, but I want you to expand a little bit. What do we know about, you talked about the end of the Bronze Age, and I remember that there was a wonderful quote from the oil minister of Saudi Arabia many years ago. The Stone Age didn't end with the end of, because they ran out of stones, right? And the oil age won't end because we're going to run out of oil. What do we know about really the kind of unwinding of civilizations? I remember a talk, about a year or so ago about the Silk Road, and the researcher had found this ancient village that was part of that infrastructure, not far from where the Chinese are building the port in the middle of Kazakhstan, right? What do we know about that ending, the unwinding part of that?
Well, we face severe epistemic problems there because often you don't have many written accounts that coincide with the end of such a society, especially at a lower technological level of development. You might just lose literacy, as was the case in the Mycenaean Greek example. Causality is also difficult always to tease out. These are interdependent systems, and there are many different hypotheses as to what exactly is the linchpin. Is the linchpin political? Something like their ability to militarily secure the trade routes. Is it perhaps is the linchpin something more economical, or is it something like knowledge and so on? I think the things we can solidly know are basically things that have left behind material artifacts. I think this is why I brought up the atmospheric lead pollution. It seems pretty strong arguments that that's a correlate. We know how that figure changed over time. We also know whether there are bronze artifacts lying around in various parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. As we know whether there's pottery lying around, and we can use those proxies to at least gauge what coincides. Now, teasing apart the causality, there's an interesting question here. I think this is, almost more not history, but an integration of history and sociology, where I think a lot of the problems that perhaps arise out of modern approaches to economics or political science or philosophy of science rest in the fact that they disregard the vast majority of the data set we have to learn from. Can you imagine a discipline of physics where we only admit the experiments done in the last 10 years? That would be a very strange kind of physics. But in political science and economics and so on, we often limit results to the last 70 years or the last 100 years. There are definitely phenomena that are not going to show up in that short of a time period.
So, is there a discipline of collapse in here somewhere? How this all kind of unwinds? It seems to me that's...
Jared Diamond seems to be the only one.
Yeah,
Yes.
he wrote the book Collapse. Yeah, it feels to me there's something very big in that question of how things actually unwind. T.S. Eliot captured it very well, not with a bang, but with a whimper. More civilizations, I think, end with a whimper than with a bang. That's probably right?
I think that's quite right, at least for several examples. The Bronze Age one is actually a counterexample. It seems to end quite quickly, 40 to 50 years. The Roman Empire, though, if you want to think about the fall of the Roman Empire, it's not literally barbarians at the gates burning things down. It's, imagine GDP is shrinking every year for 0.5% for 100 years.
Right.
At the end, you're vastly poorer. The populations of most large Roman cities, through excavation, we can do estimates of their population. There's a wonderful paper on estimating the change in the population of Rome itself that perhaps I'll link or email to people. We can tell that the population of those cities is shrinking slowly. We can tell that they're getting poorer through the various correlates that we have, and it's imperceptible. When we read the letters of the people, you have, when we read Roman letters, you have poets in the 4th century basically saying, Rome is fine, things are okay, the roads are a little unsafe lately, and I'll visit you in the spring. That's how the literate class, the elite class, the privileged class, because the people who were consuming literature were also the senatorial class and the administrative class. So they do not know on an institutional level what's happening to them. And that's why I said that, the sort of the kind of intellectual dark age question is very interesting to me because, if all the intellectuals are gone, who knows that it's an intellectual dark age? Or if all the technologists are gone, who knows it's a technological dark age? Right? I think it takes an expert to evaluate the actual state of a relevant technology. I know that whenever I'm working with someone and there's a technological question, the first thing I do is start hunting down and evaluating experts and ask them for their opinion. Because in a 6-month case study, as I might undertake, I'm never going to master the technology. I'm never going to acquire the tacit knowledge that's not even explicated. So I have to rely on someone else. I'm epistemically limited in that way.
I remember standing in front of a Roman aqueduct and looking at it going, well, how did this technology get lost?
Yeah, I've had the same reaction, exactly.
People were standing there staring at it for thousands of years, and it wasn't that the technology really got lost. It was the security from end to end that got lost. Right? And so, once you lost...
Maintenance got lost.
Well, I think it was more you bring this up about the security part, is if you have a water source and the system that, if anybody can just dam it, or poison it, or do something bad to it, or some of it falls into disrepair and no one's there to maintain it. It was really the civilization that made that world safe enough that water could travel safely from one end of that aqueduct to the other. It wasn't, people were standing there staring at it for thousands of years, they knew how it worked.
That's an extremely good point. However, I would just put a small counterexample to it. When Charlemagne unites a large chunk of what today we would consider France, Germany, and Italy, and tries to construct a beautiful mausoleum for both his ancestors and himself using Roman architecture, looking at the same beautiful buildings that are still around, it's miserable. It completely fails. So it might take a while to reinvent it, but I strongly agree with the idea that the physical security that allows you to use such a technology is vital for having there be a niche where an architect might exist or a water engineer might exist. So I think it is prior to that knowledge. So that's where I would agree and disagree with the point.
I think sometimes it's a question of funding. So the library at Alexandria that was either burnt by Christians or Muslims or whichever theory you go by, it seems that the destruction was much more a lack of funding over generations. And then the library was not maintained, it essentially ceased to exist as a center of intellectual life in Alexandria.
As a living institution.
Well, look, we had a similar situation with the space program. You know, we've already lost knowledge as we've cut funding for various things. We know less about how to build big rockets today than we did 40 years ago.
The example my father gave is the 16-inch guns that were used on battleships. Nobody could produce that in this country now. Whether we need to is a different story. The point is the technology no longer exists. Not feasible.
Does this mean that knowledge is at the effect of entropy on some level? Does entropy affect knowledge?
It straightforwardly seems yes.
Yes, it does everything.
Does that mean that we're just...
But civilization is anti-entropic. I mean, that is what civilization is in many ways. It is a measure of anti-entropy. It's higher levels of organization that persist.
So one thing I want to throw out there, this is a matter of centralized databases and archival as opposed to things that are anti-fragile and decentralized, because all institutions were centrally managed before. They go down, it's lost. But one of the keywords of things like blockchain, or frankly how information is learned in DNA, is that it's decentralized. Copies exist everywhere, and therefore can't be shut down in one area. So something I wonder is how the technology for these things, does that help with the decentralization of technology?
So that's if you're right, and I think there's something in what you're just saying, that what it implies that one of the rules of long-term civilizations is distributed knowledge, i.e. not all concentrated in one big library, as it were, and the capacity, therefore, to recreate infinitely.
But the Bronze Age example, all those people had bronze technology.
Well, they had the technology to use bronze, but the supply chains that allowed them to use that knowledge, to allow them to use that technology, broke down. So there was no reason to smelt bronze because you couldn't afford the tin. Copper was cheaper, but tin had to be shipped from some really distant places. Like the Phoenicians, again, like something like 800 BC, were sailing all the way to Britain to buy tin, right? And I think the point about distributed technology is completely correct. In the last 10,000 years, when we look at Eurasian civilization, it seems that improvements in agriculture that don't rely on infrastructure and improvements in this localized metallurgy, something a blacksmith can do, stick. Even through civilizational collapses like this, there are some advancements that are preserved, right? You know, if you import potatoes from the New World and your civilization goes south, you're unlikely to lose potatoes because they literally have a DNA. They literally are reproducing on their own. And a blacksmith that previously perhaps worked on weapons for legionaries might still find custom commissions with a warlord or might manufacture jewelry to support themselves. They have a kind of packet of knowledge that can live in many, many niches. Now, the interesting thing here, though, is like, you know, chip fabs, they need huge economies of scale. How do you decentralize something that requires economies of scale? There's an interesting contradiction in the industrial age. We can distribute the products massively, but we haven't really distributed the means to produce the products massively. Scale, living at scale, means you are centralizing things. So here's where I'm a little bit of a contrarian. I think Silicon Valley has centralized rather than decentralized society so far on net. Even though personal computers were amazing, however, our information is now processed in big computers perhaps not too dissimilar from mainframes of old. And these servers, these computers, are in jurisdictions of various governments. And I count the United States and I count Europe here as well. If you've traveled to Germany recently, try to access an American website, you might be under the impression that the German government has gone to war with the internet. A lot of American sites are blocked. Google is paying massive and massive fines for not complying with legislation that seems to be targeted at US companies, right? So there's an interesting point there where the information is now more and more being used as a tool of political control. The decentralization of information seems to be like rolling back a little bit because the physical infrastructure in which it lives is kind of centralized.
Well, you know, that raises an interesting question. Many of us, and I'll put myself right there, I suspect Stuart and a few of us, have been lamenting the fragmentation of the internet. Right?
Yes.
The idea was we would have this kind of global system that everybody would access, and universal knowledge and collaboration on a global scale, et cetera. And now we're going to have the Chinese internet, the European internet, the American internet. Well, maybe it's actually a good thing, not a bad thing, right?
It's robustness.
It may increase robustness, exactly. And so if the Chinese copy everything from the West, that may be a good thing. And I mean,
I was proposing that, like, I think on a civilizational aspect, it is extremely good for the Chinese to have good chip fabs. Yeah. But on an economic incentive landscape, no current owner of a chip fab wants like someone else to possibly, figure out how to make it.
Abby, you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to just push back on this idea of how the Roman Empire is sort of fragmented. And you could say that about the collapse of civilization you were talking about before. Eric Klein actually has a very good analysis of how ignorant we are about what happened with that collapse. And actually did a salt talk about this collapse, the Bronze Age collapse. But there's been a lot of emphasis now among historians with new technologies to look at human beings as biological, historical creatures as well as technological. So we now have evidence, in fact, that there was several very lethal outbreaks of what looks like bubonic plague, which ripped through the entire Roman Empire, actually because of its effective trade relationships. It just spread like wildfire.
Is this Justinian's plague or earlier?
No, there are actually a series of about five that have
Five, okay.
so far.
Yeah.
And they recur because the germs evolved much faster than human beings. So I think with access to DNA analysis or some of this historical evidence now, we may be able to rewrite a lot of history as biologically inflected and not just political or ideologically inflected. So I think that's one way I'd like to see that incorporated into discussion about long-term human evolution and the institutions we create.
So is there an implicit comment in what you're saying that there are causes of collapse which we have not paid adequate attention to, like, for example, disease outbreaks that may be much more common than we imagine and therefore more consequential in the tail than we've ever imagined?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's actually extremely likely because for most of history, states don't know how to measure population very well. So when we do acquire written sources, we could easily miss a drop in population of 50, 60, 70%. And then that impacts a lot of these economies of scale that would then be downstream of this like large population with high rates of specialization.
So the distribution of disease, whether that is digital disease in the form of viruses or physical disease in the form of viruses, is maybe a really fundamental thing that we need to understand as a long-term force, because it's not hard to imagine how the digital version can unwind our civilization pretty fast.
Yeah, currently any sort of a cyber warfare or computer security expert just throws up their hands in frustration and they say we're fucked.
Catherine, what were you going to say?
So, I just wanted to ask a question. So, you've sketched a lot of things to think about the evolution of civilization. What do you want to seed into the conversation about then, therefore, what that means about the design of institutions?
What I wanted to seed was basically several topics. I did point to something like a concrete synthesis, but the synthesis is less interesting than the facts I used, where hopefully other people that bring their own expertise to the table can evaluate some of the relevant points. The ones I want most thought about is how does scaling affect the distribution of knowledge? How socioeconomic niches seem to be vital for the preservation of particular technologies on this kind of anthropological sense. And number three, what kind of knowledge exists somewhere in society that we might be relying on, that we might be subsidized by, that is not yet entered into our awareness, that we don't know about, right? What is the Moscow State University research project that we don't know about? What are some other examples like the chip fab that potentially is like highly centralized and is perhaps similar to an aqueduct, right? Like, global piracy spikes up. There's no more reasons to build enough CPUs because the factory is no longer profitable because you're no longer shipping chips all over the world. The chip fab closes down. And it's, this kind of whimper, right? I hope that answered the question. So these three things are something I'd be extremely interested in talking about with basically everyone here.
Anybody else before we take a quick break?
I just wanted to ask your opinion of models of cyclical decline, decadence, and renewal. I'm particularly thinking of Strauss' Howe generation model, which has become, unfortunately, famous recently because of Steve Bannon, and shaped his thinking and his political interventions around the world, and his apparent attempts to accelerate some aspects of decline in order to bring about a renewal of what he understands as Western civilization. But of course, there are other kinds of cyclical models as well of decline, decadence, and renewal. And I'm just wondering how those fit into your understanding.
I think natural systems, even complex ones like ecosystems, often go through cyclical patterns. I think it's quite likely there's something not quite like a cycle, but perhaps a spiral. It's a fact that there seem to have not been an immortal human society so far. They often seem to encounter pretty severe problems, as we can figure out through evidence like population drops, losses of concrete technologies like, say, the Lycurgus Cup, and so on. I do think most of the cyclical theories have a problem. They want to be morality plays. They want to be morality plays. They want to tell us, now we're rich, and now we're comfortable, and now we're decadent and immoral, and we are too lazy, or something like this. And that's a problem. The problem is it obscures the real cycle, the real cycles we might find in history. It misattributes them, and they get a lot of attention. They overshadow. It's sort of like the kind of, the popular notion of a cyclical view is one where it's a matter of moral decay. Now, perhaps it actually is moral decay, but that would be like not trivial to establish. That would make all sorts of claims about anthropology, right? Economics and society, and it would have to point that this factor is actually upstream of all the other ones. I think other explanations, perhaps biological ones, or perhaps information flow ones, or perhaps economic structure ones, are more reasonable, right? Obviously, on a much smaller scale than civilizational collapse, in our current economic system, we observe this kind of cyclical pattern, right? Of like both cycles that change during the course of a business year, or cycles that are longer, like 40 to 50-year technology-driven cycles. There's also the fun question of self-fulfilling prophecy, where arguably Moore's law is kind of no longer relevant, but for a while some people proposed this is a fact about how the technology must work. And what I always asked these people a few years ago was, well, have you looked at the rate of progress in Soviet development of CPUs? That didn't follow Moore's law. Moore's law was perhaps, a business plan that was implemented and followed, rather than a necessary fact of how that technology would improve. I'm sure you have more commentary on that.
Well, not on Moore's law, but I think your point is well taken. And I want to go back to another historian that we've had along now a couple times, Neil Ferguson. Neil and I debated this subject a few years ago, and there's another dimension to the kind of alternate to the cyclical is the notion of progress. Right. Yeah. That if you read Steven Pinker, right, Pinker says, yeah, we've made a lot of real progress. If you read Ferguson, the progress is ephemeral. It is really a function of who's in power at any given moment, and if we like it, it's progress, and if not, it's not. And this progress thing is really quite a very brief moment in history. We're back to normal, i.e., struggle of the fittest and in a violent world. I think there are underlying models like cyclical, like progress, like the lack, the kind of permanence of the human condition. Neil basically thinks human nature doesn't change much, that we aren't really better people today than they were 1,000 years ago, and as a result, we're going to still do the same stupid stuff they did 1,000 years ago when presented with the same opportunities. And so there's, I think, a set of models that paradigms, if you will, of mental maps of how this long-term change happens, i.e. cycles, progress, lack of progress, that I think want to be fundamental to our thought process here.
I think that's very true.
Following on that moral issue and progress, it seems to me that we explicitly use a scorecard that we have. And if you look at baseball,
Marty, I would bet people in the back can't hear you.
If you look at baseball, the way that they evaluated players in the first half of the 20th century made certain people look like stars who now, with the new cyber analysis, don't look like stars. So, cyber analysis. It seems to me, I'm going to bring in Malcolm Margolin's book, The Ohlone Way, about the Miwok Indians. And arguably, the Miwoks had a civilization that was more viable, more benevolent, and went extinct for obvious reasons, including ours coming in on top of them. But we're going from a premise that there is a particularly aspirational version of a civilization, and the Miwoks are another version of dark matter.
I think the underlying possibility of the fragility of whatever current bubble, that is the thing to focus on, where it's easy to be triumphant, it's easy to be complacent. I think Pinker does not really address in his arguments the dark matter that is perhaps holding us together, right? And an intentional study of this, if this were to become an academic field, might reveal things that are not only good, for our chances of survival or helping us engineer more benevolent societies, but would just be perhaps like profitable, would be like a source of prosperity. I think often there's this false dichotomy between prosperity and robustness. I think we're nowhere near the productive frontier of that. I think we could have a more prosperous civilization that's also radically more stable and radically more environmentally friendly. And how to engineer that is an interesting question.
You introduced an important word that I think we'll want to come back to, fragility. And another long now speaker, Nassim Taleb, talks now about anti-fragility. What are the mechanisms that allow institutions and systems to be anti-fragile? Because one of the things we're wrestling with here is the Miwoks are obviously fragile in the sense of
Correct.
easily conquered by the massive infusion from Europe. Having said that, there's something in here around the idea of fragility that we need to develop as well.
Is there any structural reason or factors that meant that there was no Elon Musk of the Bronze Age to kind of prevent that? Presumably there is some kind of knowledge that could have prevented that. So why did that not happen?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think often, even if knowledge exists, it's not operationalized, right? For some reason or another, human beings experience a gap between knowing and acting. To reference some old intellectual matter, Plato says there is no difference. And if you knew well enough the truth of the situation, you would always act. I think this is definitely not the case. And I think, if you look at an individual like Elon or point to the real, I think very real role of particular individuals, especially in a founder context, because, not just in Silicon Valley, but when we look through history, I mentioned Charlemagne, a lot of the peculiarities of those people shaped the institutions that they created when they set them up, right? Like, the Catholic Church was earlier given as an example, perhaps not to emulate, of a long-lived institution, but it's an institution that came about because of a set of political decisions, often driven by individual ambition of various popes and so on, right? So the overlap of this kind of personal ambition, this kind of knowledge, and this ability to act is often the seed of new institutions. Why there aren't more such people? Well, that's maybe a biological question or a cultural question or a philosophical question or anthropological question. It's one I would very much want an answer to, but it's one I don't have an answer to.
And just to close this session out before we have a short break, Catherine's question I'd love to get your take on it about, you've worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of large institutions that were for some reason coming to you because they were probably at a moment of transition or in some way curious about the future. Is there something about those that you have seen that was common?
Yeah, overwhelmingly crisis.
Crisis.
Overwhelmingly. That is, people really say, we're in deep shit, and we don't know where we're going, and we need to figure out a better direction in one way or another. Or we see a crisis coming, our resource is going to go away, or their technology is going to change, or there's new competition coming on. Overwhelmingly, they do not respond until they either experience or feel or see coming imminently a crisis. More often than not, it's happened to them rather than they see it coming and they say, all right, now we need to think about the future, right? And that is the most common situation, overwhelmingly.
And was there something about some of those institutions that you saw handled that information about the future better? Or
Yeah,
worse?
the ones who'd had previous crises sometimes did better in the next one. No, I'm serious. No, I'm quite serious. They learned from, look, that's why Shell did not figure out scenario planning because it was more foresighted. It's because it fucked up and nearly killed the company in 1973 because it didn't see, it had the knowledge, didn't pay attention and said, oops, we could have done better, in fact, a lot better, and said, all right, now we'd better get good at this. So it was not because they were farsighted, it's because they learned from their crisis. And overwhelmingly, that has been my experience, is that the organizations that we worked most successfully with were those who had been through a crisis and learned from it.
So having challenges that were not existential, but were good learning experiences.
Well, they had to be close to existential, right? They had to recover. They had to be, go up to the edge and look in the abyss and say, oh my God, we need to find a better solution here. And that was overwhelmingly the case. Companies that, and governments, frankly, that saw their situation in existential terms. Look, the best planned government in the world is Singapore. And because they live in constant threat and fear of their neighbors. They say, we're tiny, these guys could take us over in a heartbeat, we'd better be economically robust, militarily strong, powerful in a variety of ways, otherwise we're screwed. And it's not because they think generously about the future and the long term, it's because they're scared. And so that really overwhelmingly has been the motivation, fear.
Another relevant example of this might be the strong success of Rwanda in recent years, where it's the fastest growing African economy. You guys might still remember from the 1990s the genocide. Paul Kagame, the current president of Rwanda, who has explicitly cited Singapore as the desired model of development, and in fact the country has been experiencing rapid economic development and stability and lack of political conflict, and even something like a national reconciliation between the Hutus and the Tutsis, which were the two ethnic groups during the genocide. He starts off as the commander of military forces from the outside of Rwanda, this really ragtag group of Tutsis, trying to intervene to stop the genocide in various ways and various places. That's where they develop a lot of the relevant organizational skill. That's where they basically train the next military and the next crop of competent people that then come in and are helping to govern the country well. So that's another case of crisis learning.
Stuart?
The existential crisis thing really fascinates me because you're pointing out that having really had one or two as an organization alerts you to future ones where you take them seriously and possibly try to work around them. But all of this anticipation of existential crises seems to have the opposite effect. AIs are going to kill us, or whatever the hell, climate change is going to kill us. Everything's going to go extinct. These things are grossly exaggerated, as if we want that
Motivation.
existential terror that will make us learn, but it's bullshit if it's just anticipatory. It doesn't have the effect you're talking about. Instead, it's deadening. What are we talking about here?
Well, I mean, isn't this partly immune response, right? Where you tell that story about the future, and we have evidence like Pinker's evidence of things have always been getting better, with very short exceptions in time, plagues and things like that. But we still, most of our science fiction right now is very, very non-utopian.
Totally.
And so, why is that? Is that a way that civilization is telling itself a story so it can make sure that story doesn't happen?
That's one version. I think the other version is that it is so unreal and it so keeps not happening. This is one of the things that you live a long time. I grew up fearing and
Nuclear war-
expecting
yeah.
nuclear Armageddon. And then there's one, Armageddon after, remember the energy crisis, 83, what
Right.
it was. We all thought that was the end of everything. I actually said it out loud in front of audiences. It was desperately, stupidly wrong.
Or about 5 years ago, peak oil.
Yeah, like that, good old peak oil or Y2K, these things come along. And it's teaching us to, in a way,
Devalue.
guard our own favorite fears.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Oh, sorry.
So I think the direction of the conversation is leading us to the matter of whether manufactured crises can be a reasonable tool of statecraft.
Why, we should declare a national emergency. Why don't we do that? I think that's a brilliant idea. It might motivate some change.
I mean, I was also thinking about how, another, government which has been very influenced by the example of Singapore and has been successful in good governance, has been People's Republic of China and the
Yes.
Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
another big influence on the party were two big influences. One is the millennia old problem of how to avoid the end of dynasties, the end of imperial dynasties, and that was a problem which Mao was obsessed with. How can the Communist Party solve that ancient challenge of avoiding the imperial dynasty ending? Another influence is Stalinism, and in Stalinism you have the idea of the purge as a way of creating crisis in the system so that you can renew it. And then, and also, of course, and direct resources to new challenges and problems. So there we have a possible example, possibly, we can say a successful example of an institution using crises in a manufactured way for long-term stability, which doesn't come from the Western liberal democratic tradition.
Well, if I may talk about that briefly, I think the manufactured crises can in fact be used to terraform parts of society, change it in various ways, and it can be very effective in that. However, the manufactured crises is a controlled experience for, Comrade Stalin or Comrade Mao or whoever else. And for them, the manufactured crisis is not challenging their thinking. It would take a genuine crisis to have those people be challenged and have them grow. So, yes, I think it is an effective tool of social engineering. And when I say social engineering, I'm all in favor of good social engineering overall, right? I feel there are many things about society we might want to re-engineer, but I don't think it solves the problem at the very top level.
I have to apologize that I have to run out for about an hour or so. I have to go help assure the long-term survival of the company I work for.
Well, this is a great time for a break. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody.
It's wonderful talking.
About 10 minutes.